Does your financial advisor take the time to really listen to you? Is your financial strategy personalized to you and your family? Will your financial advisor be there as your life and financial situation change? Hi, I'm Jerry Mangona, your Edward Jones financial advisor, and I live here in Corktown, just a few blocks from the Daily Detroit studios. When we work together, we'll focus on what's important to you. We'll use an established process to create a personalized financial strategy backed by the advice, tools, and resources to help you reach your goals. And we'll partner to help your strategy stay on track. Contact me toll-free today at 866-975-8655. Again, that's 866-975-8655. Edward Jones, member SIPC.
Did you know that there is more than DTE Energy and Consumers when it comes to Michigan and Metro Detroit's power companies? There is a difference between who does the generation and who runs the bigger grid. And that grid behind it all is ran by ITC Holdings. And I think it's a less understood part of our infrastructure ecosystem, but just as important. With high voltage lines that send power across states and managing all of that, these are the metaphorical electric freeways and train lines that without, the system just wouldn't work. I learned a lot in this conversation with Simon Whitelocke, the president of ITC Michigan and vice president of ITC Holdings, up at the Mackinac Policy Conference. Whatever you think of the current electric power situation in Metro Detroit and our state, knowing how it's set up matters. So welcome to your Daily Detroit for Tuesday, August 15th, 2023. I'm Jer Stays, and let's go to the Grand Hotel. Joining me here at the table, the president of ITC Michigan, Simon Whitelocke. Welcome to Daily Detroit.
Hello, good to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. Now, I have seen the ITC signs around. Usually it's near those like really big power things, but I wanted to first set the table by what exactly is ITC before we get into this rest of this conversation, because I think people are used to seeing like Consumers or DTE or whatever, but what ITC does is critical in like everything working.
Sure. So we operate and own the grid here in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan and 7 other states. And by the grid, that means we own the high voltage electric lines that connect generators, so where electricity is generated, to where it's consumed in homes and businesses. So we're sort of that middle part of a 3-part system that comprises the whole electrical system. So we're in the middle. We connect the end use customer to usually where the generation is occurring.
Fascinating. So how did that come about? Because I think people have this idea that they pay a bill to one thing and it's just one thing, but how did that happen?
Well, we're a little bit unique in Michigan. There are a few other examples like us, but in Michigan, about 20 years ago, there was a decision made that part of the electrical system should be separated. The grid should be separate from the generation. And this is, I won't bore listeners with the why, but the long and the short of it was so that we would have open access to the grid. And if any one generator owned it, they might control the grid to their own benefit at the exclusion of others. So it was a way to sort of create this open access, open playing field. Sort of anybody can get onto the highway, if you will. Anybody can get off of it. And that was the impetus for separating the grid from the rest of the electrical system here in Michigan back, as I said, over 20 years ago this happened. So we've been in existence since 2003, and since that time we've been just solely focused on the grid, and we've been making huge investments to improve reliability and basically get the grid to be a top-tier system. So I think listeners can be proud that they live in a state that's got a really, really good grid in terms of the high voltage aspects, which are going to provide many benefits as we move forward. We can get into that.
So you're high voltage Switzerland, basically. All right. So this ties in importantly because there's this huge shift to electric vehicles. This is, of course, going to change the demand, the times that people need things, all this stuff, because there's a lot of different pieces that go into servicing electricity. I mean, if people don't know, there's like this balancing act that all these companies have to do constantly to make sure that everything works. And it's a really complicated process. But there's also the side of all the infrastructure we need. You know, when I talk about electric vehicles, the first comment is always that person going, how are we going to do this? So, Simon, you're here. How are we going to do this?
Good question. I think they're asking the right questions because it is a pretty big shift from how things have been done. You go back 100 years ago when the grid was first, the notion of a combined electrical system was first formed. We were thinking about things much differently. We had generation that was in central locations. It was 100% controllable, and we could decide whether to ramp up or ramp down a power plant. And we didn't have electric vehicles, and now we're shifting to a world where we're getting rid of, for good reason, coal and other generation and replacing it with solar and wind, which are at the whim of Mother Nature. And then again, EVs, huge demand that we haven't seen before. So all of these things are sort of happening at the same time. And the grid wasn't designed with those things in mind. So I think where we're at today is, well, how are we going to make things work in the future? And I think it's clear that transmission is going to be a huge part of the end solution, because we have to be able to move power over longer distances. If the sun isn't shining in Michigan or the wind isn't blowing in Michigan, we may need to rely on Indiana or Ohio or Iowa or even further away to be supplying electricity to Michigan, and vice versa. It goes both ways. So sort of
fascinating. So I didn't even think about that from you think about these new sources and, well, not new, but newly popular sources, and what it takes to do that here. I didn't think about, okay, maybe we're going to move it across state lines for this.
Yes. So historically, you had a lot more control over electricity on a local level, but now we're moving to an era where we're sort of ceding some of that control to Mother Nature, and just by very nature of how things work, we already have a very connected grid. So there's Eastern interconnection and Western interconnection. We're in the Eastern interconnect, and Texas is on its own.
I was about to say, and then there's Texas.
Right. So we're all connected in the eastern part of the country. So electricity flows path of least resistance, and it also flows from where it's generated to where it's needed. So that's just naturally part of the solution. And so in the past, we've had some flows across state lines, but that's just going to increase with time. And so what we're working on are projects that would really increase the ability to move power across state lines, and not just across one state, but multiple states. So that's really what's in the works right now from a transmission planning perspective.
So what does that look like?
Well, it looks like some very large projects. So we've got a couple of projects here in mid-Michigan that run down. One runs down into northern Indiana, and that'll be the first new connection from the Lower Peninsula to anywhere outside since 1983. So it's a big deal.
So basically almost as long as I've been alive.
Yes, it's
Wow.
been a while. And
Okay.
that is going to significantly increase the capacity to move power in and out of the state, which we haven't had for a while. But that's just one of a series of projects like it that's going to go across the Midwest that'll really provide for that capability, not just for us, but for other states too, to be moving power over longer distances. So that's step one. But there's more work to be done beyond that, and that's actually in the works right now. Planning's taking place. We think by the end of next year, we'll have some more large projects like that will continue to increase that ability to have more flexibility over larger geographies.
Was some of this modernization going to happen anyway, or is this all really tied towards the shifting needs?
I think it's more tied to the shifting needs and the shifting resources. So for economical reasons, environmental reasons, age, the power plants that have existed have to be retired. And so this is the next iteration in terms of technology and capability. And I think our CEO loves to say, if you like renewables, you're going to have to love transmission, and that's just part of the deal.
What are some of the things that are required to make this happen? I mean, is it more of those towers? Is it what does this look like? Because I mean, for so many years we've driven by the big long things and whatever, and they've been fixtures. Like they're the same things the whole time. I don't remember if it's ITC or not, but there's one going down 8 Mile. There's some in Macomb County,
Yep.
whatever. And you see these things, but they've almost been like immovable objects. So what does this look like?
Yes, it looks like more of that.
Okay.
Sort of like I think of roads as we're building a new highway that's going to provide additional traffic to drive on. So yes, it's new lines like the ones that you may have seen. The technology's changed a little bit, so we use poles instead of the lattice towers that maybe are along 8 Mile. So they may look a little bit different, but essentially it's steel in the air with conductors running long distances, and that's there's really no substitute for using wires to move electricity, and that's what we need.
Is the demand increasing greatly? How much is this demand expected to increase? Do you have an idea of, like, with, say, if you add 10% more EVs, what this is going to look like? Like, because it seems like you've got the shifting of where things go, and then also it seems like a large increase in demand.
Yeah, I think that's one of the trickier questions is how much and when, and then what times of day. So the grid has been built for really like peak hour. So making sure that at 5 p.m. on a hot July day where air conditioning is cranking, that we have the capacity to move electricity and generate it and move it to where it's needed. And so I think the question is, well, what will EVs do to that peak? Will people be charging at that same time? Will they be charging off peak? And then how does that coincide with the peak generation of solar and wind? You know, when the sun is shining at its brightest and you're generating the most electricity may not be the same time that you need it the most. And that's we talked about before, that balancing act in the past. You could balance that on your own. You could control, you could turn up, turn down generation to match the load. And now we have to use some slightly different tools to do that. So that's, I think, the ultimate question is like, how much are EVs going to change consumption of electricity, and when does that ramp up really take place, and then what time of day does that occur? So we have planners that are trying to bake all of that into the models that we use to make sure that the projects that we're building today are going to be the right projects for the future. So we try and build projects that we call them no regrets, that we pretty much any scenario we look at, they'll be good projects. One of the challenges that we have is the lead times are so great. So we are talking 7 to 10 years to build a new transmission line from planning to completion. And just imagine trying to plan what the future is going to look like 10 years down the road. It's a challenging task.
There's got to be a lot of steps in that planning and everything, whether it's land, permit, like all these other things. There's got to be a ton of steps in that too.
Absolutely. It's a very, there's probably more work done in the planning than there is in the actual construction. So planning, going through the approvals at the local government, state government levels, engineering, all of that work takes years and years. And then at the very end, we start moving earth and putting steel in the air. And that's usually the last couple of years. But the challenge that we face is that we have to plan so far ahead.
But you also probably, some of it you don't know yet, right? Because these
Right.
trends are still rolling out. We've had that work from home change to an extent for some people, but then also some are coming back. How many people are going to be, say, charging at the office? How often are office parks going to have EV chargers? And, you know, maybe they have more industrial size hookups versus at home. Like, there's so many things about this, like, EV revolution. Like, we know it's coming, but not just talking to you, but talking to a number of people, there's just still a lot of details of consumer behavior that we just don't know yet.
Right. And I think some of the supplemental things like other battery storage and utilizing vehicle batteries on the grid. So you may have heard of, maybe you're plugged in at home and you can sort of sell back to the grid when it's needed. That's still to be determined how that's going to work, what the magnitude of that is, and how do we factor that into our planning and our assumptions.
I've seen some proposals for changes to some of that in Michigan law, because Michigan had kind of a more restrictive system with that, and now they're looking at maybe opening it up a bit more. So like these, it's got to be like 3-level chess for you.
Yes, that's a good description. I think so. Our planners, it's a fascinating field. I'm always in awe of what they do, but they're able to sort of cut through some of that noise and in conversations with other transmission owners, because we're all in it together. It's not just a Michigan thing. Sort of come up with real assumptions that we can work with. And there've been some trends and some I think some real activities that prove out, okay, those assumptions are probably making sense, so let's push forward with them. But ultimately, we have to make a decision and just sort of go with it. And usually we've never built a transmission line that's turned out to not be needed. It's one of these things like you buy a computer monitor. You can never buy it too big. You always have another use for it beyond what you even intended when you set out. So that's what we found. Things keep changing, and these lines provide so many different benefits, whether it's just a real-time reliability, it's redundancy, it's interconnection of renewables, any number of things. So that's one of the beauties. It provides a lot of options and flexibility, so we can go down a path and not have any regrets about it.
Where does the funding come for all this?
Well, that's one of the challenges is customers pay. So in Michigan, our costs get passed on to DTE consumers and other utilities. So
like you're going out maybe if you needed to like a bond market or money that you have or things like that. Is that how it goes?
Right. So we invest either through debt or equity. That's what we use to fund these investments, which are going to be around for 50, 60, 70 years, and we need to recover that back from customers. So we charge customers over time for those investments. And
because I think there's a public perception that's like, oh, the state needs to do this, but it's not the state doing this. It's you.
Right. Yeah.
Or your company.
Yeah. I mean, it is a team sport at the end of the day. Obviously, the state's very heavily involved in terms of setting policy. The Michigan Public Service Commission in terms of regulation of rates for distribution companies. And certain siting for ITC. So this is a team sport for sure. But we do have an largely investor-owned utilities here in the state, and ITC is one of them. And that's the model that we have. It seems to work really well. We've been very successful, and I think provide a great product at the end of the day.
Do you have any worries that this challenge isn't going to be met? Or do you think like, okay, as we learn more, there will be enough time for us to make adjustments and do what we need to do to be able to meet these challenges?
I'm a little concerned.
Okay.
Yeah, I think time is of the essence. I think we're a little bit behind in terms of because we're off because you sort of have to make leaps of faith at times. Most people are reluctant to just push forward without having every I dotted and every T crossed, but that's the nature of the business that we're in, as I described, the longer term planning. So you never are 100% sure until the time comes, right? So I think that has been part of the challenge is with all these moving parts and pieces, there inevitably is some pushback to say, hold on a second, do you really need to do that? So if we rewind the clock and we look back 10 years, the last time we built large scale transmission like this in the Midwest, arguably we didn't build it big enough. So the minute those projects went in service, they were fully subscribed. So imagine building a brand new highway, and on day one, you got traffic jams. That's essentially what we've had from the projects that were built 10 years. We just didn't build them big enough. We didn't build enough of it. So now we're back at it again. So I think there's always this hesitation to overcommit, but yet we always need more. And so I think in the last couple of years, we've made some great progress. As I mentioned, that big new project that's coming in, and I think we're going to get some more. So that's encouraging. But that we're going to need that to get through to maintain reliability, and we need to keep that moving. If that stops, then I'll get worried again. But I think we're in a good place now, but time is definitely of the essence.
When or kind of what was the piece of information or whatever where you're like, all right, this is going to happen. There was this debate for a while, like are EVs going to take on or all this other stuff. Same with renewable energy, right? There's people who say, oh, well, that was never going to happen. Well, it did. And so what was the time or the moment where you're like, okay, this is the world now. We just have to get ready for it. This isn't about like a discussion. This is happening.
Well, I think back to when I first started at ITC, so almost 20 years ago, renewables were just in their infancy. There really wasn't much there. There was a lot of concern about can they really work? Can this, how do you integrate them into the grid? And lo and behold, now we're at like 15 or 20% renewables on the system in a pretty short period of time. And so we sort of have these moments where like, you try, and all of a sudden the floodgates open. And I think now in the last few years, the floodgates have opened again in terms of the renewables with the retirements and the acceleration of the retirement. So I think
So when you say retirements, what does that mean?
retirements of all the traditional coal-fired power
Okay.
plants that DTE Consumers and other utilities in the state have announced. First, it was, well, we're going to do it in 2040. Then it was 2035. Then it was 2030. Now it's 2020. You know, the acceleration of those retirements has really accelerated the need for us to do what we need to do. We've also had recently the Inflation Reduction Act is another example where you've got tax credits which now have some certainty, which over time we've kind of gone back and forth. And so investors have been a little bit shy about committing. And well, there's now certainty for the next 10 years of what the tax credits are going to be. So we've seen a huge influx of generators, solar, looking to connect to the grid. And so that gives us some clarity about what the future really is going to hold. I think the same thing on the EV side, where you see the manufacturers, GM and others, saying, look, by a certain date, we're just not going to make internal combustion engine cars anymore. Like, we're just going to be electric only come 2030 something, right? So those sort of, I think, stakes in the ground really help us be able to plan for the future, and I think give us all the impetus that we need to make the decisions that we need.
With those retirements, and in a general sense, because I'm not going to ask you to speak about any other companies, but I know that this has been a trend nationally. This is not like, this isn't a consumer thing. This isn't a DTE thing. This is across the nation. What pushed those up?
Well, I think age was the primary driver. So a lot of the infrastructure was built, say, in the 70s. There was a huge build out of also transmission back in 50s, 60s, 70s, and then sort of stabilized for a while. So those are naturally aging out. On top of that, you have the environmental benefits or concerns around them. And then I think the cost profiles have just changed for solar. You know, it's sort of like on, what's that, Moore's Law? You know, it's on
it increases
yes,
exponentially
right.
after a certain point.
Slowing down a
yeah.
little bit, but
Yeah.
that has happened. Same thing on wind. You know, the productivity, the efficiency versus the cost has definitely improved, and it's become more cost effective. So that's hence the acceleration. It's like, why wait? You know, if you know you're going to save money, why wait to save that money? And if you're going to get all the environmental benefits too, then you'll do that too. So that really has upped the pace and the volume of those projects that are replacing the coal plants that are retiring. And that's where we come in. We have to figure out how to interconnect them onto the grid, get them up and running as soon as possible, and that's really we're really rolling on that, and that's going to be the case for the next decade or so.
Well, I feel a little bit better that you seem to feel confident about all this stuff, right? Because you're in the chair.
Yeah, I think we'll be okay, but it's one of those things that you can't take your eye off of it, and I think we have to be alert to. So just as the time frames kept shortening, you know, I think there'll be other changes, and there are other things that we have to deal with, like the weather. We're seeing far more bad storms, huge temperature swings, things like that we have to deal with.
Well, it's not just for generation, but also for dealing with repairs and such. Like a big storm. I mean, I've never, like, does that damage that kind of infrastructure? Like, I've never thought about that, right? When I've had a power outage.
It can. We're definitely more hardened, but we have had storms that will just come through, and derechos and other high wind events will just take out stuff that isn't supposed to go down. And
because Mother Nature always wins.
She does. And so between the weather, we also have man-made. If you follow the news, you've got folks in other parts of the country that have been dealing with some sabotage and things like that. So we have a lot of other challenges to deal with at the same time. So that's why I say we can't rest. We have to keep upping our game to deal with what's happening, both weather-wise and just from a consumer perspective. EVs, other electrification, I think, is another area that we haven't really gotten into too much. Sort of trying to decarbonize other parts of your home, for example.
I don't own a lawnmower. I mean, I have a lawnmower,
Right.
but it's now electric, right?
Right.
I made that switch. Or
A gas
your leaf
stove.
blow-
Yeah.
gas stove,
Yeah.
right? That's a whole nother huge thing. And that
Heating,
also,
industrial heating, cooling, all of those areas I think they're coming down the pike. So I think, as I said, we're just going to have more and more and more things coming at us, and ultimately I think the transmission system will be a part of the solution, a big part of the solution, pulling it all together.
Well, I have a whole new appreciation for all those lines and all the things that you do, and I really appreciate you, Simon.
Thank you. It's been great, Jer.
Thank you to Randy Walker for editing this episode. Feedback, as always, 313-789-3211, or email me, dailydetroit@gmail.com. With that, I am Jer Stays. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.